Now, the truth is that today was inevitable when we decided to pull the financial support that was artificially keeping companies like Holden in Australia, that eventually there was going to be a day where they were going to shut up shop completely. Because, unsurprisingly, the major reason why people had a loyalty to Holden was that this was an Australian car, that they were built here, that they were about us. Well, when that disappeared, as well as a whole bunch of bad bets on woke, Holden, well, squandered what was left of their ability to stay in the market. A friend put this perhaps callously, but still pretty well today, which was that Holden was, to the Australian motoring industry, what is a family member or friend who's been crook for some time. And even though their passing is not a surprise, when it actually happens, it's a gut punch. And I'll tell you why it's a gut punch. Not just because I'm a motorsport fan, not just because, as I keep saying, I'm a cashed-up bogan, but you can see in this program every night, the stuff that is behind me is an expression of the things that I love and that I want to share with you. For me, Holdens were the biggest asset that the family owned outside of the house. They were the example, as was taught by my grandfather to my father and my father to me, about how you take care of something. Now, I know that there are lots of people who are Ford families and some people who are couldn't give a stuff families, but I'll explain right now why mine was a Holden family. This is not the actual, but it's a version of the car that my grandfather so proudly brought home, his first new car. This was my father's first brand new car. My dad loved the feeling of a brand new Holden. Over and over again, he would bring something new home, be it as a young man. And the EHs, the EQs, once we started to get into those magnificent Kingswoods, these were my dad's pride and joy. This was where every Saturday, regardless of whether I was a little boy or a teenager, it was always the same thing. You vacuumed the car, you got out the Armour oil, you washed it, and you polished it. And that's where I got the chance to bond most with my dad, was over the same type of car that he was able to learn from his dad. It's the place where my brother and I, as we were little people who could reach no higher than the bonnet, eventually measured how big we got all the time, because could you eventually touch the roof? And then how far across the roof could you end up reaching? All of which slowly but surely would impress Dad as he would slowly but surely walk back, and then eventually you would get to wash his prized possession. There's the Gemini that my brother and I were our first cars. So too for my brother-in-law Danny, who equally to this day is an absolute Holden fiend. After these cars, once it was my chance to be able to start to own them, you know how much I love this car, the 1983 Commodore SLE. All luxury on the inside, all bogan on the outside. And what I loved most about this era of car, it had more places for ashtrays than cup holders. By the 2000s, and once it was time to feel a little bit executive, I got the chance to drive around, of course, in a Statesman. So you can imagine to me what the experience was like, knowing how important a Holden was to Dad to be able to eventually learn how to drive in one, to eventually have the freedom to go wherever I wanted as one. This was a brand of the suburbs. This was a place where, yes, motor racing was all about race on Sunday, sell on Monday. But this was a brand that we loved in Australia because it was our own. Now, don't forget, Holdens weren't just Murray-mobiles. They were the Prime Minister's car. Hawke, Howard, Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, they all called that their limousine. While the American president had that massive long stretch limo, we had a Holden. This was a brand that we loved because it was ours, because for much of the 20th century, the way that you showed your worth in the Western world was your ability not just to build, but to design, refine, sell and have pride in a car. Now, yes, it represents a time when tariffs meant that we weren't importing cars like we do today. The Holden car eventually had to give way because wages in this country, clearly, well and truly in front of places like Taiwan, Vietnam, and much of Asia where these cars ended up getting made. So again, I don't want us to pretend that we're all still wallowing in the 1980s and still yucking it up like it's the 90s. But the fact that generations of people were told that not only to buy this car was a symbol of freedom, but it was a symbol of Australianness, of Australian exceptionalism. The fact that a fellow Australian somewhere had got their hands dirty building one of these things is what gave you pride. Now, sure, some of them were occasionally German designed, or occasionally some of them were banged together in parts of Asia, but you get the point that the badge meant something. The badge meant something because more than 7 million of these cars had been made in this joint, in a place when we didn't have 25 million people living here. And because I was a child of the 80s, and it's fair to say, sitting in front of the television did at times count as a third parent, the marketing was magnificent. It was a certain type of masculinity, Australiana, awesomeness. Remember when ads made you excited about something? They didn't sell any woke messages. They just said, how cool's this car? Roller tape.
To fire your imagination, new Commodore SS. Australia's chariot of fire, burning with 8-cylinder performance. 4.2 or the fire of a full 5 litres option. Red hot outside and inside, cool command. New Commodore SS at your Holden dealer, if you can stand the heat.
I love it. I just love that that was the telly of my childhood. I love that it was a symbol, again, that links back to Dad, Granddad, neighbours across the road. And remember, the pride that Australia had was shown when Ben Chifley was there for the very first Holden that rolled off the production line. A total of 7,687,675 cars were made here in Australia, right up until a couple of years ago when the last one rolled its way through the production plants. Of course, the extension of this love of this car that connected my brother, my family members, my mates, was motorsport. All of those cars meant weekend after weekend the chance to be able to sit and watch these people who were absolute legends, heroes. Why? Because in part they were racing for our team. And I'll be rather honest, when it came to parts of suburban Australia, the three things you believed in, well, it was Jesus Christ, the Liberal Party, and Holden. Or, perhaps, it was Jesus Christ, the Labor Party, and Holden. There was very few variables in that equation, but the equation remained the same. Each of these people holding a mantle of millions of people who loved the chance to be able to go as fast as them. We'll have a chat to them a little bit later in the show. So was today inevitable? Yes. Is today sad? Bloody oath. It's sad not just for us fans, but of course it is a huge change to the life of hundreds of people who still worked for this company. Hundreds of people who were still involved in designing cars, yet they never told you that's what they were doing. Hundreds of people who work across the country in lots of car dealerships, small businesses that essentially had spent a lifetime building something up that is basically worthless today. Shame on General Motors for their attitude in these final years, where as soon as the money dried up, they pissed off. The brand that meant so much now means so little to Australian consumers because, of course, it ain't the same thing anymore. So are there more important things than a car company going out of business? You bet. But the reason I pause tonight is because a type of Australia is about to disappear. Even when Vegemite was bouncing in and out of Australian hands, you never doubted that it'd be there on the shelf when you went to the shops. But that's the case now when it comes to Holden. Regardless of who owns it, regardless of what they're pushing, it's not an option anymore. And that's sad for Australia.